High on the edge of the North Pennines, between the Tyne and the Wear, stands a town built on fire. Consett, a place that once glowed red against the night sky, where the air itself shimmered with heat and dust. From these hills came the steel that helped shape the modern world. It became rails that crossed the continents, the framework of great bridges, and armour plate that protected nations in times of war. For more than a century, this was one of Britain's proudest industrial towns, a place where work wasn't just what you did, it was who you were. But every empire has its dark hours. When the furnaces fell silent in 1980, Consett almost fell silent too. Thousands of livelihoods gone, families broken. The sky that once burned with light turned cold and grey. Yet from the ashes, the people rebuilt, not with steel this time, but with resilience, spirit, and a huge amount of pride. To understand how a town could rise so high, fall, and rise again, we have to go back much further than the age of steel. Back to the very beginning, when this hilltop was the edge of another empire. This is Rails and Revolutions. The history that built us, the forces that shaped us. Long before blast furnaces ruled these hills, the Romans marched through this landscape, bringing order, roads, and the iron that held an empire together. Not to Consett itself, there was no town here then, but close by, at outposts of one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. At Vindemora, now the quiet village of Ebchester, stood a fort on the great Roman road of Deer Street, a vital artery linking York to the wild northern frontier. Unfortunately, now covered by the modern village. At Vindemora, now the quiet village of Ebchester, stood a fort on the great Roman road of Deer Street. A vital artery linking York to the wild northern frontier. A few miles to the south of present-day Consett, Longovicium commanded the high ground, although little remains today apart from possible building outlines viewable on LiDAR. An auxiliary fort with stone walls, workshops and aqueducts that fed its baths and forges sat here. Roman soldiers and craftsmen worked on local iron ore on a remarkable scale. They forged tools, nails and weapons, the small sturdy things that held the empire together. They were drawn here for the same reasons later generations would be. Iron in the soil, timber and coal for fuel, and a landscape that commanded the horizon. But the Romans were not meant to stay forever. By the early 5th century, their empire was faltering, stretched thin across Europe and collapsing under its own weight. The northern legions were recalled to defend Rome itself. Forts like Longovicium and Vindamora were abandoned, their forges cold, their roads slowly swallowed by moss and soil. The north returned to silence, but the earth remembered, because once iron has been found, it is never truly forgotten. For nearly 1,000 years, the hills above the Derwent Valley lay quiet. Farmers grazed sheep where legions had once stood guard. The roads of Rome faded into holloways, and the smoke of the forges drifted into memory. But beneath the heather and peat, the same raw power remained. This plateau was built on a treasure chest of industry. Ironstone seams close to the surface, coal lying in abundance nearby, and limestone from the hills of Towlaw and Stanhope. All the ingredients for smelting, iron, fuel and flux lay within reach. Few places in Britain were so perfectly equipped for fire. By the 17th century, small forges like this one at Derwentcote appeared across County Durham. They were primitive, powered by charcoal, but they marked the beginning of something greater. Men began to understand what the Romans had already found out centuries before, that the hills of the north could be turned into power and profit. Before Consett's furnaces, another fire burned just a few miles away in the village of Shotley Bridge. In the late 1600s, a group of German Lutheran swordmakers emigrated to England and brought with them secrets of steel that had never been seen here before, the subject of another video on the channel linked here. They chose the Derwent Valley because its fast rivers, clean water and nearby iron deposits mirrored their homeland. Here, they forged blades so strong and flexible that they were said to bend double without breaking. Their craftsmanship built a reputation that spread across Europe, arming kings and soldiers alike. Though their trade faded by the 1800s, their knowledge of tempering, forging, and the alchemy of steel lingered in the valleys that surrounded Consett. When the Industrial Revolution reached County Durham, it found fertile ground. Coal, the black gold of the northeast, ran in seams under the hills near Consett. It was the lifeblood of the furnaces, burned to melt iron ore into steel. Without coal, the steelworks could not have existed. And without steel, the coal mines would not have developed as much as they did. In 1840, a man named Charles Attwood and a small group of local businessmen, engineers and investors saw what others had overlooked. The Consett Hills, rich with ironstone and coal, were a natural force for industry. Attwood, a visionary with a keen eye for both engineering and opportunity, became the first managing director of the Consett Iron Company. He believed that with the right combination of skill, labour and technology, this remote inland site could compete with even the largest coastal ironworks. The early years were a trial by fire. Furnaces cracked, machinery failed, and transporting raw materials over the rugged plateau was slow and costly. Many doubted the viability of the enterprise, yet Attwood and his colleagues pressed on, assembling a workforce that would become legendary for its skill and endurance. Local men and later Irish immigrants fleeing famine laboured side by side to build the furnaces, rolling mills and infrastructure that would form the backbone of the town. By the 1850s, the works began to flourish. New blast furnaces were constructed, puddling furnaces multiplied, and rolling mills started producing iron that could stand against the best in Britain. Attwood oversaw every detail, from furnace design to labour organisation, instilling a culture of precision, innovation and pride. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, the Consett Iron Company expanded into one of the largest inland iron producers in Britain. Attwood and his successors adopted the latest technology, steam power, coke-fired furnaces, and improved rolling techniques, while never losing sight of the people whose hands kept molten iron flowing. Rails, plates, and girders poured from the works, shaping Britain's railways, bridges and ships. It was more than a business. It was a living, breathing industrial city, a town and company growing together, each forging the other's destiny. By the late 19th century, the Consett Iron Company had not only transformed a patch of North Pennines Hills into an industrial powerhouse, but had laid the foundations for a community built on resilience, pride and shared purpose. A legacy that would burn bright for over a century. Beneath Consett streets, fields and hills lay another town entirely, one built in darkness. Coal was not just fuel for the furnaces, it was the foundation everything else rested on. The plateau around Consett sat above rich coal seams, worked long before the steelworks arrived. As demand for iron and steel grew, the pits multiplied. Driven deeper, wider, and further beneath the landscape. Beneath Consett streets, fields and hills lay another town entirely, one built in darkness. Coal was not just fuel for the furnaces, it was the foundation everything else rested on. Collieries such as Blackhill, Dowles, Medhamsley and the Lanchester Valley pits fed the furnaces. Wagons creaked along inclines, hauling coal day and night towards the blast furnaces. These were hard pits. Low seams, broken geology and water always pressing in. Men worked by lamplight, cutting, loading and hauling coal in dangerous conditions. Accidents were frequent. Roof collapses, fire damp, flooding, runaway tubs. A shift could vanish in minutes, leaving widows and children waiting at the pithead for men who might never return. It was places like here that many Irish families found work. Fleeing famine in the 1840s, they took the hardest, most dangerous jobs for the lowest wages. Above ground, tensions sometimes boiled into violence. Underground, survival depended on the man beside you. Differences faded in the darkness. Coal and steel were locked together. The pits fed the works sustained the pits. One brother underground, another at the furnace. Fathers sent their sons into steel, hoping for something safer. The toll was immense. Coal dust scarred lungs, long shifts bent backs. Men emerged blackened and exhausted, carrying the weight of the underground with them. Yet there was pride, quiet, stubborn pride, in knowing the fire above ground only burned because of the darkness below. By the mid-20th century, mechanisation arrived. Conveyors, cutters, powered haulage, but danger never fully disappeared. And as steel markets eventually faltered, the colliery's future grew uncertain. But the story of Consett Steel was not written underground alone. The coal and iron had to meet the furnaces, and that journey shaped the very rhythm of the town. Tracks ran from pit to furnace, carrying coal and ore. The blood of Consett, every wagon fed the fire, every spark forged the town. This network of rails and inclines was more than infrastructure. It was lifeblood. Without these lines, the furnaces would die, the mills would fall silent, and the town would stop. Steel and community rose together, each feeding the other, each shaping the heartbeat of this plateau. As you follow the tracks from mine to furnace, you see the interdependence of every element. The men who dug, the hands that loaded, the engines that hauled, and the fire that waited. The landscape itself became an industrial organism. Hills and valleys mapped to the pulse of production. Every mile of iron laid was a promise. The furnace will burn, the mill will turn, the town will endure. By the late 19th century, the Consett Iron Company was already producing roughly 132 to 175,000 tonnes of iron and steel annually, with iron plates rolling out at 1,600 tonnes per week. By 1911, annual output reached roughly 227,000 tonnes, reflecting the company's rise as a national powerhouse. Through the 1940s, post-war production climbed to 300 to 390,000 tonnes annually. And by the 1960s to 1970s, weekly output reached 27,000 tonnes, pushing annual totals over 1 million tonnes. Across its entire history, the works produced an estimated 120 million tonnes of iron and steel, leaving a legacy felt across the world. Furnaces burned day and night, their glow turning the night sky red. Steel here which transformed into rails, girders and armour plate, forged with precision and pride. The iron travelled across the world, carrying the weight of nations and the mark of Consett's hands. Tyne Bridge, completed in 1928, bears the strength of Consett steel, as does the Blackpool Tower, completed in 1894. Across the oceans, the Sydney Harbour Bridge carried the same legacy. A monument of endurance built from County Durham's iron. During wartime, armour plate for the Royal Navy ships and armoured vehicles rolled from these works, hardened to protect and survive. This was not an abstract industry. Men here knew their work mattered. Steel for ships, bridges, railways, tangible proof of their town's impact. Generations followed each other into the works. Steel was not just what Consett made, it was what Consett was. Rows of stone cottages rose near the works, each home with a small yard, close enough to hear the roar of the furnaces at night. Families lived, ate, and dreamed of the smoke of the chimneys as a constant backdrop. These company-built homes were more than shelter. They were the backbone of a community. The town park at Consett was constructed on land reclaimed from the Steelworks and gifted to the community in 1891. It was designed as a green respite from the blackened industrial landscape, a place where children could play, brass bands could perform, families could gather after long shifts. Here, many of the trades involved in the industry are carved into stone as you walk up the main path. Sporting clubs, social halls and reading rooms were all within walking distance of the gates of the works, intertwining the life of the steelworks with the life of the town. The steelworks and its housing created a rhythm to daily life. Shifts dictated the movement of the streets. Children grew up with the smell of molten iron in the air. Fathers and sons walked together along familiar paths to the blast furnaces. Every corner of the town, every alley and terrace was touched by steel, not only in material, but in memory, in identity and pride. As the works expanded, so did the demand for labour, and tensions rose. During the Great Famine of the 1840s, thousands of Irish families arrived in the northeast seeking work and survival. They dug the pits, laid the tracks, and poured the furnaces. With them came not only strength and skill, but also a culture and faith distinct from many of the Protestant workers already here. By 1851, nearly 22% of Consett's population was Irish-born, and this rapid demographic change fed anxiety and competition in a town still finding its feet. Across the early 1840s, there were frequent clashes between Irish Catholics and Protestant workmen, sometimes sparked by drink, sometimes by prejudice, and often by fear that newcomers willing to work for lower wages threatened livelihoods already hard won. One 1844 scuffle at the Highgate public house ended with furniture used as weapons and arms stained in blood. All of this hostility culminated in late 1847 in what became known locally as the Battle of the Blue Heaps. A confrontation more rooted in rivalry and resentment than in war, but no less dramatic for its place in local history. The same heaps that bore the weight of early industry also became a de facto stronghold for one side of the conflict. mainly Irish newcomers who had settled nearby and, rightly or wrongly, were resented by those who saw their work and livelihoods as being under threat. When opponents confronted each other around these heaps, stones and crude weapons were cast like ammunition. On one side, a small cannon intended for ceremony salutes was even mounted, though fortunately it was never fired. The trouble was serious enough that military aid was summoned. A company of soldiers stationed at Shotley Bridge marched in to help keep the peace. Father Kearney, a Roman Catholic priest from Legate, was widely praised for his calming influence amid escalating tensions. In the aftermath, 195 men were sent to trial at the quarter sessions. 12 were found guilty and bound over, legally obliged to keep the peace for a year, a period in which not a single one was reported to have broken his bond. What today might seem like tribal skirmishes were at the time deeply felt expressions of fear, survival, instinct and cultural division. But the Battle of the Blue Heaps also marked a turning point. After 1847, formal disturbances diminished. Long-held rivalries gradually softened as the Irish community became woven into Consett's fabric, contributing not just labour, but institutions such as St Mary's Catholic Church in Black Hill, raised largely through Irish Catholic fundraising and labour. Over time, those who once stood opposed as rivals in pits and public houses came to work side by side, and Consett's identity became both more complex and more unified, forged in the same fires that shaped its steel. One of the things I enjoy most about making these documentaries is the detective work that happens long before I ever arrive with a camera. Every film begins with hours of research, comparing historic maps, reading archived documents, digging through old newspapers, and piecing together information from dozens of different sources to uncover stories that have almost been forgotten. That research mostly happens online, which is why I use NordVPN. If you've never used a VPN before, it's a service that encrypts your internet connection, helping you keep your online activity more private and your personal information better protected. Particularly if you're using public Wi-Fi in places like cafes, hotels or libraries. NordVPN also lets you securely connect through servers in different countries, which can be useful when accessing online resources or content that's available in other regions. On top of that, features such as the built-in Threat Protection Pro can help block many malicious websites, scam links and trackers before they become a problem. Whether you're researching local history like I do, travelling or simply browsing the internet every day, it's a straightforward way to add another layer of security online. If you'd like to support the channel, you can use the affiliate link below, and they're currently giving 75% off and 3 extra months. Every subscription also comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it out completely risk-free. Now, while communities like Consett were learning to overcome old divisions, the town itself was about to enter the period that would define its place in history. By the early 20th century, Consett Steelworks were a national powerhouse. The steelworks were not just a single building. It was a sprawling industrial city in miniature, a network of fire, iron and iron-willed workers. By the late 19th century, the works covered around 500 to 650 acres, making it one of the largest inland steelworks in the UK. The air, streets and machinery were perpetually dusted in a fine red powder, iron oxide, a byproduct of smelting, coating walls, clothing and skin. It was a visible mark of the fire and ore that powered this place, a constant reminder that the land itself had been transformed into industry. Furnaces burned day and night, their glow turning the night sky red. At the heart of the works stood the blast furnaces, towering monuments of iron and brick, roughly 55 feet high, with half diameters of 9 to 12.5 feet. Air blasted through multiple turbines drove combustion deep into the furnace charge, keeping molten metal flowing into the cast houses below. By 1847, as many as 14 furnaces had been built, though records show that earlier Consett Iron Company holdings may have had 18 in total. Not all in use simultaneously. These furnaces fed a chain of puddling furnaces, plate mills, angle and bar mills, and a melting shop nearly 900 feet long, lined with converters and gantry cranes to move tens of tons of molten steel between processes. Beyond the furnaces were smithies, foundries, repair shops and brickworks capable of producing 12,000 bricks per week. Gasometers, power stations and pumping facilities supplied energy and water to sustain continuous operations. Over 1,000 coke ovens produced 500 to 600,000 tonnes of fuel annually, feeding the furnaces day and night. Chimneys dotted the skyline like stone sentinels, venting smoke that mingled with the red glow of molten iron. Streets ran beneath buildings, walkways carried workers swiftly from furnace to mill, and a strict system of shifts, gates and watchmen regulated the flow of labour. Every yard, siding and furnace had a purpose. Every molten drop of steel was a journey from ore to rails, girders or armour plate. In the northeast, steel produced at Consett through the works of Durham and Long helped form the Tyne Bridge, opened in 1928. Its sweeping arch becoming a symbol of modern Britain and industrial confidence. And half a world away, steel formed here, crossed oceans to become part of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. Its strength born on a hilltop in County Durham. In times of war, that same steel was rolled thick into armour plate, used in Royal Navy warships and armoured vehicles, hardened to protect and survive. Men in Consett knew where their steel was going, into railways, bridges, ships, and they took pride in it. Generations followed each other into the works. Fathers, sons and brothers walked the same paths, breathed the same red-streaked air, and carried the same knowledge forward. Steel was not just what Consett made, it was what Consett was. At its height in the 1960s, the Consett Steelworks employed around 6,000 workers, many of whom lived in the town and whose routines were shaped by the shifts and chimneys of the works. During wartime, workforce numbers may have reached as high as 12,000, reflecting the urgent demands of national industry. The red dust, iron oxide settled everywhere, a constant mark of the town's lifeblood, and a visible reminder that from these hills came steel that shaped the world. Then came 1980, the year the furnaces fell silent, and Consett almost fell silent too. For decades the works had been the heartbeat of the town. Skilled hands turned raw ore into steel that built railways, bridges and armour. Yet in the boardrooms of London, decisions were being made that would sever this lifeline. The government and British Steel argued that the works were unsustainable. They pointed to ageing infrastructure, blast furnaces built for a different era, inefficient and in need of vast investment to modernise. Consett's inland location made transporting coal and ore more expensive than newer coastal plants, which could import raw materials and export steel more cheaply by sea. And with global steel flooding in from Japan and Europe, the works faced intense international competition. Even if Consett was profitable, in 1980 they argued maintaining it long term would require huge investment, and focusing resources on modern automated coastal plants would secure the future of Britain's steel industry. But for the people of Consett, these arguments rang hollow. The works were still producing high quality steel, employing thousands, and forming the very core of the town's identity. Critics called the closure economically short-sighted, a move that sacrificed a functioning, skilled workforce for distant policy objectives. The social cost was immediate and devastating. 3,700 jobs disappeared almost overnight, with thousands more supporting industries affected. Unemployment soared to 36%, one of the highest in Britain. Shops closed, streets emptied, families struggled. Support for workers was uneven. The government and company focused on directly employed staff, offering redundancy and retraining, with thousands of ancillary workers, contractors, suppliers and subcontractors were left without help. Older workers were nudged into early retirement. Younger, less skilled employees faced few alternatives, and bureaucratic hurdles meant many fell through the cracks. For many, the closure was more than loss of jobs. It was the end of a town's identity. Consett had lived and breathed steel for generations. Sons who had followed their fathers into the works were suddenly without purpose. Children saw a future that had once seemed certain vanish before their eyes. The closure of the steelworks also sealed the fate of the coal pits. Without furnaces to feed, the collieries that had laboured for generations lost their reason to exist. Pits like Blackpool, Delves, Medemsley and Lanchester were shut. Spoil heaps left to weather, shafts capped, and the underground world fell silent. The event was remembered as the murder of a town, the rupture in the life and spirit of a community built around fire and iron. Families scattered, shops closed, pubs emptied, The glow that had defined the town for 140 years vanished, replaced by dust and silence. Yet even in these darkest hours, the people of Consett began to show the resilience and determination that would define its next chapter, because while the furnaces had fallen silent, the heart of the town was far from extinguished. Consett did not remain silent for long. Over the decades, the town has found new ways to thrive. Number 1 Industrial Estate, established on the former Steelworks site, became a cornerstone of revival. It hosts a diverse array of businesses from light manufacturing to trade services, providing employment and breathing new life into the local economy. Project Genesis, launched in the 1990s, redeveloped the derelict steelworks into a vibrant mixed-use community. New housing, retail spaces and public amenities transformed the landscape. While Fawcett Park became a green heart for the town, linking heritage and modern life. Even as the town reinvented itself, the surrounding landscape still bore the imprint of its industrial past. Huge slag heaps, the cooled remnants of molten waste from the blast furnaces, remain scattered across the hills. These enormous mounds, hundreds of feet high and covering dozens of acres, once symbolised the scale and intensity of Consett steelmaking. Fire, iron and human endeavour made tangible in blackened stone and metal. In recent years, researchers have turned their attention to these tips, studying how heavy metals, alkaline soils and mineral residues interact over time. Investigations into vegetation colonialisation, soil chemistry and water runoff are providing vital insights into the recovery of post-industrial landscape. What was once considered waste has become a source of knowledge, helping guide environmental restoration efforts both locally and around the world. The streets were alive once more. Shops, cafes and community centres pulsed with activity. Public art and memorials honour the past. While schools and parks give the next generation space to grow. The same grit and pride that forged Consett in iron now shapes it in new ways, resilient, adaptable and forward-looking. Today, children as steelworkers walk different paths, yet they carry the legacy of the town in their blood. The memory of smoke-filled skies, roaring furnaces, and even the great slag heaps lives on. Not as sorrow, but as a story of survival, reinvention, and enduring identity. Consett has been reborn, proving that even when the fire dies, the heart of a community can keep burning. Today, much of Consett Steelworks has been swept away, but a few fragments remain, relics that carry the weight of a town's fire and industry. The ladle, still perched on its vast cradle, looms like a silent guardian. Once it carried molten metal hotter than the sun, shaping rails, plates and girders destined for the world. Down by the river, the Victorian pump house remains. its brickwork weathered, its machinery silent. Here, water was the lifeblood of the works. Cooling furnaces, powering steam sustaining the pulse of Consett. The pumps once throbbed day and night, unseen yet essential. Much like the thousands of hands that laboured unseen beneath the slag and smoke. Visiting these remains, you are struck by contrasts between silence and past fury, between cold metal and human warmth, between decay and enduring legacy. Even in ruin, the Steelworks communicates its story, a story of ingenuity, risk and determination, of a town whose people made fire a language and steel a signature. These remains are not just monuments to industry, they are touchstones of memory. Walking among them, you can almost feel the glow of molten steel, hear the call of the foreman, sense the heartbeat of a community forged in fire and iron. Consett's story isn't only written in iron and coal, it's written in the people who carried a piece of this town into the wider world, turning local grit into global recognition. Amongst its most famous sons and daughters are those whose talent and ambition took them far from these hills. Rowan Atkinson, born here in 1955, became one of the most recognisable faces in comedy worldwide. From the delightfully awkward, almost silent Mr. Bean to the razor-sharp satire of Blackadder. Atkinson's genius lies in taking the ordinary and turning it beautifully sideways. A craft honed perhaps in a town where ingenuity was as vital as labour. Alan Armstrong, born in nearby Anfield Plain, attended grammar school near here in Consett, where a teacher inspired him to try acting. Years later, he brought the intensity and rhythm of the North East stage to national and international audiences. His performances, whether on screen or stage, echo the determination, resilience and expressive storytelling embedded in Consett's cultural fabric. Singer Susan Morgan, born here in 1938, carried a smooth, emotive voice across the UK and beyond. In 1960, said Bobby's Girl was more than a song. It was a sound of ambition rising from working class roots, of talent forged in the same region that once forged steel. Each of these figures took a piece of Consett with them. They carried its identity beyond the furnaces and pits, into laughter and drama, melody and lyric, into stages and screens far from the North Pennines. They prove that while steel built the town, imagination, creativity and human endeavour carried its spirit into the world. Consett was born from the iron in the ground and fire in human hands. It rose through effort, endurance and belief, and when the furnaces fell silent, it did not disappear. What was made here still stands, in rails, bridges, ships and cities shaped by steel forged on this hilltop. And it remains here, in ladles and pump houses, in slag heaps turned to study, in streets that still remember the rhythm of shifts. But the strongest thing Consett ever produced was its people, their resilience, their pride, and their refusal to be erased when the fire went out. Do you have a connection to Consett, or have family members who worked in the steel industry and had tales to tell? Let us know in the comments. Consett is no longer a town of furnaces. It is a town forged not in steel, but in its strength, in memory, in enduring spirit. Because here, high on the edge of the Pennines, the furnaces are no more, but a fire still burns brighter than ever.